Atlantis, perhaps history's most famous lost civilization. For centuries, people have crossed oceans searching for it. Some believe it was a kingdom of gold, others only a myth, a story that never existed. But one question remains, one that's often overlooked. Everything we know about Atlantis, where does it come from? Because here's the surprise. Atlantis wasn't found on an ancient map. No inscription, no lost manuscript. Instead, one man, a Greek philosopher named Plato. Around 360 BC, in two works, Timaeus and Critias, Plato told a story that captivated the world for 2,500 years. A lost civilization, an empire beyond the sea. An empire thought to be unbeatable. Then, in a single day and night, it vanished forever. But Plato's story wasn't just about its fall. It was also about its birth, its rise, its power, its hubris, and ultimately, its fall. So let's go back to a story told 2,500 years ago and discover what Plato really wrote about Atlantis. According to Plato, Atlantis didn't begin as an empire. It began with a family. Long ago, on a vast island in the middle of the sea, stood a high hill. A young woman lived there. Her name was Cleito. Legend says her parents, Evenor and Leucippe, were among the island's first inhabitants. But in time, both passed away, and Cleito was left alone on that hill. Sea on every side, nature all around. On that vast island, a young woman living in solitude. But that solitude wouldn't last, because according to Greek myth, Poseidon, god of the sea, saw her and fell in love with Cleito. It is said, to keep her safe, Poseidon surrounded the hill with great rings of land and water. A ring of water, then land, then water, again land, as if nature itself had become a fortress. Slowly, that place became extraordinary. It became sacred, a place where the story of Atlantis would begin. Time passed. Cleito gave birth to 10 sons, 5 pairs of twins. Poseidon divided the great island among his sons. Each received his own land, his own kingdom. But the eldest was Atlas, and from his name, the land became known as Atlantis, the land of Atlas. Atlas was more than just a king. He marked the beginning of a new age. Under his rule, people from many lands came together. New settlements rose. Roads were built. Fields began to flourish. And the sea, once the island's boundary, became its path to the future. No one could have imagined that one day, this land would become history's most famous lost civilization. The age of Atlantis had begun, but its future was yet to be written. Poseidon's 10 sons now ruled different parts of the great island. According to Plato, though the kingdom was divided, it remained one. Its rulers saw themselves as one family, one shared legacy, one shared destiny. Time passed, and Atlantis grew. Stone was quarried from the mountains. Forests were harvested for timber, and the sea was no longer a boundary. It became Atlantis's greatest strength. Wherever their ships sailed, Atlantis's influence followed. But their strength wasn't built on wealth alone. Plato tells us the rulers lived by sacred laws, laws that kept them from turning against one another. Instead, they stood together. From time to time, the 10 kings gathered together. They honored their ancestors. They upheld Poseidon's laws and swore an oath to preserve the unity of Atlantis. Years passed, then generations, and slowly an island kingdom became an empire. Its wealth grew. Its people flourished. Its power grew, and with it, its ambition. But this was only the beginning. Its greatest age of Atlantis had yet to come. Generations had passed. Atlantis was no longer just a kingdom. It had become a civilization known across the seas. In Plato's account, its great city stood at its heart. A city built within vast rings of land and sea, as if shaped by the hands of a god. Great bridges linked those rings. Between them flowed broad canals, allowing ships to sail into the city's heart. But its greatest marvel was the great temple of Poseidon. It was more than stone and marble. It was the soul of Atlantis, its identity, its glory, a monument to Poseidon's greatness. In those days, the people of Atlantis believed their glory would never fade. Their cities would stand forever. Their ships would rule the seas forever. But history's greatest tragedies often begin at the height of greatness. According to Plato, its first rulers still carried their divine heritage. They were powerful, yet disciplined. They were wealthy, but never greedy. To them, wealth and power were never the goal. And because of that, Atlantis flourished for generations. But time changes everything. Slowly, that divine legacy, the one Atlantis took pride in, began to fade. Plato writes that over time, the divine within them began to fade. Their human nature took its place. Perhaps that was the moment Atlantis began to change. Where duty once came first, ambition took its place. And as Atlantis grew stronger, so did its hubris. Perhaps that was the illusion that changed its destiny forever. According to Plato, when the gods saw that Atlantis had strayed from its true path, a council was called on Olympus. There, among them, stood the king of the gods, Zeus. It was there that the fate of Atlantis would be decided. But here, Plato's story suddenly ends. Zeus rises to address the gods, and then the story falls silent. What was said next, we do not know. But one thing is certain. After that, its darkest day of Atlantis was about to begin. Because Plato's story falls silent here, but what followed still echoes through history. Legend says Atlantis stood at the height of its glory. Then the day arrived. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, the earth trembled, slightly, just enough to bring the city to a pause. For a brief moment, the entire city stood still. Then it shook again, harder than before. Temple walls began to shake. Palace columns trembled, and for the first time, fear took hold. But it was only the beginning. Within moments, the shaking grew stronger. Roads began to break apart. People rushed into the streets. Children cried. Screams filled the air. Then, the sea itself awakened. On the horizon, towering waves began to rise. At first, no one believed it. Then, no one knew what to do. And then, it was too late. Massive waves crashed ashore. Ships were tossed like toys. The canals overflowed, bridges collapsed, and the sea moved toward Atlantis. The very sea that had made it prosperous now had come to consume it. People ran. Prayers echoed through the temples. Families searched for one another. The entire city fought to survive. But before nature, no one held power that day. For hours, the earth and sea showed no mercy, and the great civilization began to fall apart. Then, darkness, silence, destruction. When it was over, the sea was calm again. The waves rolled on. The wind still blew, as if nothing had happened. But Atlantis never returned. Plato writes, "In a single day and night, Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea, and with it, an entire world was lost. But its story was far from over." Years passed, then centuries. New civilizations emerged, others faded into history. The world moved on, but Atlantis was never forgotten. Plato's story lived on through the ages. Some dismissed it as myth, others saw a warning, and some still believed that behind every great legend, somewhere, a fragment of truth remains. Perhaps that's why the search for Atlantis never ended. Then, in the 20th century, some began looking at the mystery in a new way. One of them was James Mavor Jr. He wasn't searching for treasure, nor trying to prove a lost empire. He was searching for one answer. Could Plato's story be rooted in a real event? That question led him to the Aegean Sea, a place where countless civilizations had risen and many had vanished. Mavor believed that if Atlantis was inspired by real events, history had to hold its traces. Then, a discovery changed everything. Santorini, a volcanic island in the Aegean Sea. In 1967, led by archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, excavations began. At first, it seemed like another archaeological dig, but as the ash was cleared, the past began to emerge. Walls, streets, buildings, and then an entire city, hidden for thousands of years. Its name was Akrotiri. It wasn't Atlantis. At least, no evidence has ever proved that. But it raised a new question, because the parallels between Akrotiri and Atlantis were hard to ignore. A thriving maritime civilization, a devastating catastrophe. Was it only a coincidence? Or had Plato preserved the memory of such a disaster? Even today, no one knows. But for the first time, the line between Atlantis and history didn't seem so impossible after all. Perhaps it was only Plato's imagination, or perhaps it preserved the memory of a real event we simply don't know. And perhaps that's what makes this story so powerful. That's why we're still searching for it today. Atlantis, a myth or a forgotten memory? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to follow for more stories like this.